In the 1960s, Alan Burkhart opened a riverfront restaurant in Beaumont, Texas. And for the next 50 plus years, his customers would eat burgers, drink beers, and on super hot days, they would jump off the pier into the river to cool down. But one day in June of 2015, while Alan was in his restaurant looking out the back window, he saw something strange in the river. When he went outside to get a better look, he noticed his customers who were eating outside had also noticed this strange thing, and now they were standing up and nervously watching it as it floated by. Alan immediately yelled out to everyone to not go swimming, obviously, based on what they were seeing, and then he went back inside and made a sign that said no swimming, and he posted it on the pier. A few weeks later, on July 2nd, a 28-year-old local man named Tommy Woodward and his girlfriend, Victoria LeBlanc, arrived at Alan's restaurant for a fun night out. After several hours of drinking and playing pool, Tommy and his girlfriend made their way over to the bar and had a seat, at which point Tommy began telling his girlfriend that he planned on going swimming in the river that night. The bartender overheard him and said, "Tommy, you can't go swimming in the river anymore." But Tommy was a bit of a rule breaker and said he didn't care, he was going to go anyways. The bartender began pleading with him and even got other staff members of the restaurant to talk sense into Tommy that he should not get in the water. But eventually Tommy just stood up, he grabbed his girlfriend's hand, left the restaurant, and began walking down towards the pier. The bartender at this point just kind of rolled her eyes and thought, I can't do anything to stop him, and so she went back to her bartending duties. When Tommy and Victoria got down to the pier, the black water was quiet and calm as Tommy took off his shirt and removed his valuables from his pockets. Right before Tommy was about to jump into the water, Victoria stopped him and said she thought she saw something moving underneath the pier. But Tommy just laughed and said he didn't care and jumped into the water and disappeared below the surface. Immediately, the water around Tommy seemed to erupt like a bomb had gone off underneath him. When Tommy came back up to the surface, he was screaming and trying to swim back to the pier, but before he could get there, something pulled him under the water. And then a few seconds later, Tommy came back up again, and this time Victoria could see the left side of his torso was bleeding profusely. And so she instinctively leapt into the water to try to save him. And Tommy, even though he knew he needed help, he said to her, "Get back on land, save yourself." And so she obliged. She climbed back onto the pier, and when she turned around, she caught a final glimpse of Tommy as he was pulled back under the water, and this time he did not come back up again. The bartender had heard screaming and so ran down with a flashlight to the pier, and when she got there, Victoria was hysterical and she was yelling Tommy's name and looking out over the water. And so the bartender at this point is reasonably certain she knows what happened to Tommy, but if by some miracle he's still alive, she wants to find him. And so she raises her flashlight and she began scanning the now totally calm black water, and as she's scanning, she finds him. He's floating face down way off in the middle of the river, and as soon as the flashlight hits him, something pulls his body under the water and he disappears from view. It was no secret that the river that ran next to Alan's restaurant was home to alligators. But these alligators were small and they didn't bother anybody, and so the locals really didn't have any issue swimming with them. In fact, they had nicknamed two of the alligators that were seen the most often. They named them Cheeto and Marshmallow. But on that day in June of 2015, when Alan and the other guests saw this thing out in the river, what they were seeing was a monster alligator, the likes of which they had never seen before in this river. It was at least 11 feet long and over 400 pounds, and that summer it decided to make the underside of Alan's pier its home. And so that night, when Tommy leapt into the water, it was this monster alligator's feeding time, and so Tommy became its dinner. About 2 hours after Tommy was attacked, what was left of him was recovered from the river. Tommy became the first alligator-related fatality in Texas in nearly 200 years. Just north of San Francisco, California, lies Lake Berryessa, which is a massive freshwater reserve that provides drinking water and hydroelectricity to hundreds of thousands of people. The lake is not a natural occurrence. A dam was built in the area in the 1950s, and after it was in place, the water that pooled above it became Lake Berryessa. During the dam's construction, the engineers realized the structure would not be enough to keep all the water in if the lake were to flood. To solve this problem, the engineers installed what's called a spillway in the middle of the lake. A spillway is like a huge drain. When the water levels in the lake are normal, none of the water will go into this drain. But when water levels reach a certain point, the water, instead of spilling over the side of the dam, will spill into this spillway, and it will travel 200 feet straight down the 78-foot wide pipe. And when it reaches the bottom, the pipe bends sharply to the right, and the water is shot out on the other side of the dam into a creek. On a summer day in 1997, 41-year-old graduate student Emily Schwalik was swimming in the recreational side of Lake Berryessa. That evening, before she got out of the water, she decided she wanted to have a closer look at the spillway, which at the time, because the water levels had risen high enough, water was pouring down into this spillway. So Emily turned around and began casually swimming away from the recreational area towards the center of the lake. At some point, she would have seen signs poking out of the water, and she would have seen them on land telling her to stay back. After passing those signs, she would have reached a long line of red caution buoys that were the last line of defense to try to keep people back from this spillway. But Emily went under those buoys and continued on towards this huge drain. Meanwhile, the other swimmers that had seen Emily take off towards the middle of the lake, they didn't think she would actually get close to the spillway. Nobody went close to the spillway, and so nobody tried to stop her. Around 6:10 p.m., Emily made it to right before the edge of the spillway. It would have been deafeningly loud as 360,000 gallons of water poured over the edge into the spillway every second. Emily most likely was trying to get right up to the edge and then grab that outer cement lip and kind of anchor herself and then lean over the edge and get a look down into the hole. But what ended up happening is as she got closer and closer to the edge, the current picked up so dramatically that it began pulling her down into the hole. And so by the time she's over this cement lip, she had already turned around, realizing her mistake, and was trying desperately to swim away from the spillway. But it was too late. Her legs got whipped around and sucked down into the spillway, and she managed to grab onto the lip, the outer lip of the spillway, with her legs now in the spillway. Thousands and thousands of gallons of water are pouring down on her face, and so she can't pull herself back up. So she's pinned inside the spillway. People on land noticed this happening to her, but they realized there was nothing they could do to help her. If they tried to go down there and pull her out, they would get sucked in too. And so they called the authorities, who have the right equipment to pull her out. But by the time they got out there, it was too late. Emily had managed to hang on to that edge for 20 minutes. But finally, the water overpowered her, she lost her grip, and she fell backwards down the 200-foot chute to her death. On August 6th, 2018, a manager at a grocery store in Lancaster, California, which is a town about an hour north of Los Angeles, started getting complaints from his staff and from customers about a terrible smell coming from the front of the building. The manager, who had come in the back door that day and so hadn't smelled anything, began walking through the store towards the front in order to investigate. He only made it to the cash registers before he had to throw his arm over his mouth and his nose because the whole front half of the store reeked. The manager's first thought was that food must have somehow fallen somewhere out of view and it was rotting, and that was causing the smell. But when he went past the cash registers and went out the front doors, the smell got exponentially worse, and he noticed the smell was predominantly coming from this brown liquid on the ground that seemed to be leaking out of the base of one of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so the manager thought, well, it can't be food that's causing the smell. It's got to be a sewer pipe leak that's happened right underneath this pillar, and it's seeping up through the cement, and that's what's causing the smell. And so the manager went back inside the store and he called a plumber, and then a couple of hours later, the plumber showed up. The manager pointed at the brown liquid out on the front and explained what he thought was going on, and the plumber looked at it and then looked at the manager and said, there's no sewer pipe underneath here, so whatever that liquid is, it's coming from inside the pillar. And so the manager was stumped because this pillar and all the others in the front of the store were purely decorative. There's no reason anything would be leaking out from inside of them. There was nothing inside of them. And so the manager asked the plumber to pull off one of the bricks around the area where this liquid was coming from so they could see what was on the other side. And so the plumber got his crowbar and he began prying off one of the bricks. And then once it was loose enough, he pulled the brick away, revealing an opening into the pillar. And the two men got down and they looked inside, and what they saw horrified them. And they immediately backed up and they called the police. 5 days earlier, a 35-year-old man named Ray Rivera was pulled over by Lancaster, California police on suspicion of driving a stolen vehicle. As soon as the officer got out of their cruiser and began approaching Ray's vehicle, Ray peeled off down the road, turned the corner, and was gone. The officer immediately got back in their cruiser and took off after Ray, but he had gotten a huge jump start and he had fled into a highly populated and busy area where it would be relatively easy to blend in and disappear. The officer called for backup, and before long, there were dozens of other cop cars in the area looking for Ray, but no one could find him. A little while later, the police heard over the radio that a car matching the description of the one Ray had been driving had just crashed into a local grocery store. And so the police head over to the grocery store, and sure enough, there's Ray's white pickup truck crashed into the side of the building, but Ray is nowhere to be found. The police began asking witnesses at the store if they had seen the man driving the white pickup truck, and a few said they had. They said after he crashed, he leapt out of the vehicle and he ran inside the grocery store and then went up a flight of stairs to the staff-only area. The police went inside the grocery store and searched the staff-only area, and they searched the rest of the grocery store, but he wasn't there. And so they assumed at some point after going inside, he managed to slip back out again and had escaped on foot. And so the police, just as a precaution, stayed outside of this grocery store for several more hours in case if Ray was in there, they would catch him trying to leave. But after a couple of hours, he never did. And so they put out a warrant for his arrest and they left. Well, it would turn out Ray had run inside the grocery store, but he had never left. After running up to that staff-only area, he found a crawl space and he hid inside of it for several hours until the police left. And then at some point that evening, he decided he wanted to find a better hiding spot, and so he made his way onto the roof. Now, it's not entirely clear how he did that. Either the crawl space he was in directly connected to the roof, or he got out of the crawl space and then found his way onto the roof another way. But regardless, he found his way onto the roof, and when he got up there, he realized the roof was totally flat until you got to the very front edge of the building, the part that looked down into the parking lot. There, on the roof, was this small structure that was built up just on the front end of the roof that gave the impression from the parking lot looking up that this building was a lot bigger than it really was. On the backside of this phony structure was a door that was accessible from the roof. Ray saw this access door and ran over to it. He tried the handle and it was unlocked. And so he opened it up and he went inside. Now, this attic-like space that sat on the front of the building really didn't have that much of a purpose to it. However, it did provide access to the insides of all of the pillars that lined the front of the store. And so it's believed that Ray, as soon as he walked inside, saw these openings and believed one of them would be the perfect hiding place. And so he lowered himself feet first into one of these hollow chutes. He got his feet and his legs, his hips, and most of his torso into this tight 9-inch by 17-inch space, but his shoulders were too broad. They would not fit into the pillar. And so he raised one arm over his head and he kept his other arm pinned by his side in order to make himself as narrow as possible. And this worked. Inch by inch, he began sliding deeper and deeper into this 2-story tall pillar until he was completely out of sight. But as soon as his shoulders had gone down into that pillar, he would have realized he had made a grave mistake. With one arm pinned above his head and the other pinned by his side, he would not have been able to pull himself back up out of this narrow space. He was stuck. And so he probably began squirming and trying to use his feet to try to get back up into the attic space, but all of that movement only made him slip farther and farther down into this pillar until his feet touched the ground at the absolute bottom. And so not only is he already in this totally compromised position that would have made it hard to breathe, he was also in such a narrow space that the walls of this pillar literally were crushing his chest, making it nearly impossible to get a full breath of air. And when he screamed out for help, nobody would have heard him because he was entombed inside of multiple layers of cement and brick. Also, making an already horrible situation that much worse, Lancaster, California was experiencing a very significant heat wave that month. And so all day long, the sun would have been blazing down on the outside of that pillar, heating up the inside like an oven. 5 days after Ray got trapped, the plumber removed that brick on the pillar, and he and the store manager bent down and looked, and they saw Ray's leg. The smelly brown liquid that had been coming out of the pillar that had alerted everyone to this in the first place was purge fluid, which is something that comes out of a decomposing body. So that's gonna... On the evening of December 28, 2016, a 54-year-old man named Don Fluitt drove down the highway into the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beside him was his 11-year-old daughter, Sienna, who had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. They'd been driving for nearly 12 hours, all the way from Don's mother's home in California, where they'd just spent Christmas. But the holiday had not really been a happy one. because a few weeks earlier, Don's sister, Janice, had died of breast cancer. And Janice was really one of the only true close family members Don had left. His dad and his other sister were both already dead, and his younger brother Dennis wasn't talking to him after a big argument the year before. So, as soon as Don had gotten the news that Janice had unfortunately passed away, he'd immediately negotiated with his ex-wife to take their daughter, Sienna, and go see his mom. He wished they could have stayed longer, but he had to get back to work. Don had a job at an agency that served the developmentally disabled, and there was a big meeting coming up that he just couldn't miss. Just then, Don slammed on his brakes. Traffic ahead was piling up, and the car in front of him had slowed down to an abrupt stop. Don felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, and he laid on his horn. He was about to roll down the window so he could scream at the driver in front of him, but then he saw Sienna open her eyes in alarm in the seat next to him, and he stopped himself. Don took a deep breath and reminded himself that it was just traffic and it wasn't worth getting angry about. Don used to have kind of a temper when it came to driving, but in recent years, he'd been working hard to control it so he could set a good example for his daughter. So after the traffic finally let up, and as he rounded an exit off the highway and drove through downtown Albuquerque toward his house, Don deliberately tried to shift his focus to something positive. It was already Wednesday, which meant it was only a few more days until Spaghetti Sunday. And that always made Don smile. Spaghetti Sunday was a tradition that he and Sienna had started together a few years ago by making big batches of food every Sunday after church and bringing the food downtown to feed the homeless. At first, it had just been the two of them, but over time, more people had joined in the effort, and pretty soon it had grown into a real event with whole groups of volunteers coming out to serve food and drop off clothes and canned goods. Don felt proud that he'd created something so meaningful for the community, and it was especially important to him that he had done it with Sienna. Finally, Don turned down a quiet residential street and parked in the garage of a 2-story stucco townhouse decorated with Christmas lights. He got out of the car with Sienna, grabbed their suitcases, and walked to the front door and unlocked it. And when his daughter stepped inside, she shrieked with excitement, because waiting for her under the Christmas tree was a brand new bicycle wrapped in a shiny bow. She turned around and asked her dad if she could give the bike a spin around the block right now. Don wanted to say yes, but it was already dark out, and this was supposed to be a quick stop at his house, and when he looked at the clock, he saw that it was almost 7. He'd already had Sienna for most of December, including the whole holiday, and he had to get her back to her mother's house soon. Don and his ex-wife, Christine White, had a pretty civil relationship, but he knew she would be annoyed if he asked for more time. So Don told Sienna the bike would have to wait, but for now, just go grab whatever she needed from her room, and then they would leave. As Sienna ran off, Don noticed something strange. He hadn't seen his golden retriever, Buddy, who usually rushed out to greet him whenever he came home. So Don walked through the living room and down the hall, calling out Buddy's name, and finally found the dog cowering in the bedroom. Don extended his hand, and Buddy skittishly came forward to sniff it. And Don was a little unnerved by this. Buddy usually did not act scared of him, but then again, Don didn't usually leave for weeks at a time either, so he just told himself that, maybe this was just separation anxiety. So he gave Buddy a pat on the head, filled his bowl with kibble, and then grabbed his keys for the short drive to his ex-wife Christine's house. Don drove to Christine's very slowly, trying to enjoy every last bit of his time with Sienna. Don treasured the time he had with his daughter, because the mistakes he'd made when he was younger had almost gotten her taken away from him. These days, Don lived a squeaky clean life and went to church every Sunday, but it was not always that way. He had partied a lot when he was younger, and when Sienna was a toddler, he'd gotten fired from his dream job as a firefighter for failing a drug test. And then after he'd lost his job, his then wife, Christine, had to shoulder most of the family's bills, and after a few months, the strain on the marriage was just too much. Christine filed for divorce, which was crushing for Don, but even worse was the possibility of losing Sienna. Don actually already had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and after that divorce, his first wife had gotten sole custody of those kids and moved them all to Oklahoma, so Don had barely seen them for most of their childhoods. He was determined not to make that same mistake with Sienna. So he'd gone to court to fight Christine and her new husband, Terry White, for shared custody. The court battle had gotten a little contentious, but it was worth it, and Don made the most of every moment he got to spend with Sienna. He'd braid her hair before school and make costumes for her school plays, and on the nights when she was at her mom's house, he always called her before bed to say goodnight. Now, Don pulled into Christine and Terry's driveway, and Christine came outside and stood by the front door with her arms crossed. She motioned to her watch, clearly annoyed that Don was late. Don got out of the car and sort of apologized and told her it had been a really long drive from California, and they'd only stopped a few times for gas and bathroom breaks, and they'd hit some traffic. That was why they were late. Christine sighed and said it was okay. She asked about the trip, and Don told her it went well. They had a great Christmas despite the, sadness over his sister's death, and it had been very meaningful just to be together. Before Sienna ran inside the house, Don pulled her in for a big hug and kiss, and then he promised to call her before bed as usual. And when he saw her again that weekend, they'd have plenty of time to test drive that new bike. When Don pulled back into his garage 10 minutes later, he noticed that the trash can at the end of his driveway was lying overturned on its side. So he parked his truck, walked down to the curb, and flipped it upright. Then he walked back up the driveway, pressed a button to close the garage door, and unlocked the door to his townhouse. And while he was taking off his shoes and jacket, he could have sworn he heard the garage door stop closing and roll back up again, as if something had maybe tripped the sensor. He stopped to listen, and now what he heard was the sound of the door actually closing again and actually hitting the ground with a soft thud. He shook his head and decided he must be imagining things. Don dragged his suitcase into the bedroom and began to unpack. All he wanted to do was just relax and not really think about anything. But when he carried his toiletries into his bathroom to put them away, he saw a small hole in the ceiling and let out a frustrated sigh. Don had been hounding his landlord about patching that hole for months, and he'd been hoping it would have been done by the time he got home. So he made a mental note to give the landlord yet another call about it in the morning. When he was finally finished unpacking, Don put his jacket and his shoes back on and then headed out to the garage to smoke a cigarette. The following morning, December 29th, at the office where Don worked, his coworker, Valerie Torres, was settling down at her desk when her phone rang. Valerie picked it up and heard Don's daughter, Sienna, on the other line. Sienna told Valerie that her dad did not call her last night and asked if he was there now at the office. So Valerie stood up and peered over at Don's desk, but it was empty. This was a little unusual since Don was a pretty punctual guy, but it was still early, so she told Sienna not to worry. She would give Don a call now, and she was sure he would call Sienna right back. Valerie hung up and dialed Don's cell phone, but he didn't answer. So she sent him a text message, and she waited. But after half an hour, Don still hadn't replied, and now Valerie was starting to feel concerned. It was not like Don to skip work without calling in, and then ignore calls and texts too. And so Valerie discussed it with another coworker, and they decided to just go swing by Don's townhouse themselves and check on him. The sky over Don's townhouse was dark and cloudy when Valerie pulled into the driveway. She and her coworker got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Valerie knocked on the door, but to her surprise, it actually just swung right open. She looked over at her coworker, then the two of them nervously stepped inside. Valerie immediately called out Don's name, but he didn't answer, so she wandered into the living room and peeked into the bedroom, but the house seemed empty. Valerie's coworker, meanwhile, headed up the stairs to look for Don on the second floor, and Valerie headed out to the garage to see if maybe Don's truck was there. And when Valerie opened the door to the two-car garage attached to the townhouse and flipped on the light, she saw Don's truck was in its usual spot. But something else caught her eye. On the back wall of the garage, behind the neighbor's SUV, she noticed a streak of something dark red on the wall. At this point, Valerie started to feel pretty nervous. But nonetheless, she began walking towards that back wall to see what was going on over there. And as she got closer and closer, she was staring at the streak, wondering if her eyes were playing tricks on her, until finally she was close enough that she could actually look down at the space between the SUV and the red streaked wall. And when she looked down, she screamed. A little before noon on that same day, Albuquerque police detective Matthew Kaplan pulled up in front of a 2-story stucco townhouse secured with yellow crime scene tape and swarming with police officers. 2 women wearing business clothes were sitting on the curb, and both of their faces were stained with tears and smeared makeup. All Detective Kaplan knew was that a man had been found dead in a garage attached to this townhouse, and now he, Detective Kaplan, was heading up the investigation. So he got out of his car and walked up to the open front door, and a policeman standing in the entryway filled him in on a few more details. The victim had been identified as Dawn Fluitt. The 2 women outside were his coworkers, who had come here to check on him when he hadn't shown up for work that morning. There were no signs of forced entry, and the women said the front door was open when they arrived. Kaplan stepped inside the townhouse into the living room, and right away he saw a brand new bicycle sitting under a Christmas tree. Then he did a slow loop through the first and second floors and noted there was a cell phone on the couch and a wallet on the kitchen counter. It didn't really look like anything had been rifled through. The drawers in the house were not hanging open, and the house generally was neat and orderly. And so on first glance, this did not appear to Kaplan like a robbery. Back on the first floor, Kaplan headed into the garage, where crime scene techs were busy photographing the scene and collecting forensic samples. Kaplan knelt down next to Dawn's body, which was laying face up between an SUV and the back wall. Dawn's throat was cut with a gaping wound that ran from one side of his neck to the other, and there were smaller cuts and scrapes near his eye, his ear, and on his hand, as if he had tried to fight back. There were also signs of blunt force trauma, as if he had been hit by an object like a baseball bat or maybe just a fist. And when Kaplan looked closely, he saw burst capillaries on Dawn's eyes and eyelids, which he knew were commonly a sign of strangulation. This killing was unusually violent and gruesome, which Kaplan knew meant this was likely personal. Kaplan stood up to examine the blood that was spattered on the walls and refrigerator above Dawn's body, and the bloody handprints on the side of Dawn's truck. There was no blood on the floor around Dawn. However, it sort of appeared like somebody had recently mopped and maybe tried to clean up the blood afterwards. That's when Kaplan noticed an empty bottle of bleach on top of the washer nearby. So he walked over, he opened up the washer, and sure enough, he found piles of wet towels inside that actually still smelled like bleach. Just then, a crime scene tech came over carrying luminol spray, which is a chemical used by law enforcement to detect blood. And so Kaplan stepped back so he could spray the area, and then Kaplan followed him around as he made his way through the house. The luminol spray did pick up traces of blood on the kitchen floor and the sink too, and Kaplan figured the suspect had tried to clean up the crime scene in the garage and then wash their hands or the murder weapon in the kitchen before leaving. But it is much harder to scrub a murder scene than people realize, and so as Kaplan left the house, he was feeling fairly hopeful that the crime scene techs would eventually recover some of the killer's DNA. Kaplan stepped through the front door just as a car pulled up and parked at the end of the driveway. A man got out of the car and pushed past the crime scene tape, and immediately Kaplan put his hands up to stop him. This man looked totally flustered, and he introduced himself as Benny Ruiz, the landlord, and asked what the police were doing on his property. When Kaplan told Benny that his tenant, Dawn Fluitt, had been murdered, Benny gasped, then started talking a mile a minute. He said Dawn was a devoted father and a religious man who would open up his home to anyone and that nobody would want to kill him. But then Benny paused and made a face like something was just occurring to him, and he said that actually there was one lead he could think of. He told Kaplan that Dawn did charity work with the homeless, and he said it was possible that somebody from the street could have maybe broken into Dawn's house and killed him. After Kaplan finished talking to Benny, he sent him on his way, and then he just stood on Dawn's driveway, thinking about what Benny had said. Based on the extreme violence of the murder, and the fact that nothing appeared to be stolen, he doubted very much that this had just been a break-in by a random homeless person. He thought it was much more likely that Dawn's killer was someone Dawn knew, and maybe even someone who had a key, based on the fact that there was no evidence of forced entry. And since Dawn was a big and muscular guy, and it was clear he had fought back with his attacker, Kaplan figured he was probably looking for a strong, potentially big male suspect. The question was, who would want to kill Dawn Fluitt? From what the landlord and the two coworkers who had called 911 had said, Don seemed to be a really stand-up guy. If he had any dark secrets, they were very well hidden. The next day, December 30th, Detective Kaplan went to the house of Dawn's ex-wife, Christine White, and her husband, Terry White. Kaplan had spoken to Christine the day before just to break the news about her ex-husband's death, and also to see what she might know about the murder. Christine hadn't had any ideas about who would have wanted to hurt Dawn, but she'd mentioned that he used to have a problem with road rage, and he had just finished a 12-hour drive, so maybe he had gotten into it with another driver, and maybe they had followed him home. But she also said their daughter had been with him, and she didn't mention anything about that. The only other thing Christine could think of was that Don had actually told her that his dog was acting skittish when he had gotten back from that road trip. Kaplan had quickly ruled out Christine as a suspect because she had an airtight alibi. Don had dropped Sienna off at Christine's around 7:45 the night he was killed, and then she and Sienna had spent the rest of the night together. Her road rage idea seemed as unlikely as the landlord's theory that a random homeless person had broken in. And the information about the dog was interesting, but not particularly helpful in identifying a suspect. But now Kaplan was back at Christine's house because he still needed to speak to her husband, Terry, who had been out of town last night for work since he was a truck driver and often worked long shifts at odd hours. But as the husband of Dawn's ex-wife, he was a natural suspect. When Kaplan rang the doorbell, Terry opened the door and greeted the detective with a polite smile. Kaplan entered the living room where Christine and Sienna were sitting and said hello, and then asked them to leave so he could speak to Terry in private. Terry sat down in an armchair across from Kaplan. He seemed calm and friendly as he told the detective that he and Dawn didn't have much contact with each other, but their relationship was not exactly bad. It was just awkward because of the custody battle Dawn had had with Christine. Ever since then, Terry said, he'd tried to keep the peace by just sort of avoiding Dawn. He knew Sienna loved her dad like crazy, and if he accidentally sparked a conflict, Sienna would likely take Dawn's side. As for the night of Dawn's murder, Terry told Kaplan he was at his sister's house until about 9 p.m., and then he left and he stopped at Wendy's on the way to work, and then he took a nap in his truck in the parking lot before going in for his shift. After Kaplan left and went back to the station, he immediately called Terry's sister and also Terry's boss, and they both confirmed Terry's whereabouts, which meant that Terry's alibi was solid, and Kaplan was back to square one on suspects. But while he was writing up a report on Terry's interview, his phone rang with a call from one of Dawn's neighbors. She told him she had been looking over the footage from her security camera for the night of Dawn's murder, and she found something that she thought the detective might want to see. Kaplan stopped writing his report mid-sentence and drove right to this neighbor's house, where she led him inside, to her computer, where she pressed play. Kaplan leaned in close to the screen and watched the black and white footage of the side of Dawn's townhouse shot from the top of the driveway next door. At 7:41 p.m., a few minutes after Kaplan knew that Dawn and Sienna had left for Christine's house, a hooded figure could be seen in the corner of the frame. The figure tipped over Dawn's trash can and then walked up the driveway toward Dawn's garage and disappeared from the screen. About 15 minutes later, the video showed Dawn driving into the garage and then walking out again to go pick up the trash can and then walking back up the driveway. Now, the garage door itself was not in frame, but the camera did capture a faint glow of light coming from inside Dawn's garage. Kaplan could see that light dimming, which meant the garage door was closing, but then inexplicably, the door must have begun going back up again because the light began to get bigger. And at the same time, there were several brief flashes of light, and then after the flashes, the light began to dim again, which meant the garage door closed, eventually leaving the driveway in darkness. Kaplan got a copy of this video, and then left the neighbor's house and walked over to Dawn's, trying to piece together what actually happened on the video. He stood inside of Dawn's garage and held the garage door clicker in his hand, and he pressed the button to close the door. And as it closed, Kaplan walked closer until he was almost directly underneath the door's path. And then, when that happened, all of a sudden, the door stopped because Kaplan had actually tripped the sensor by going right underneath it. And as soon as he tripped the sensor, a light on the top of the garage flashed 3 times as the door not only stopped, but began going back the other way. It was clearly how the system worked if it was tripped. And so once he saw that, Kaplan thought about those strange flashes of light he saw in the video, and then also that hooded figure he had seen lurking near the garage. And all at once, it was like the pieces clicked into place. The suspect must have followed Dawn into the garage. But when they went into the garage, perhaps they tripped the sensor, and so as that door was coming down, the suspect's trying to sneak in, they trip the sensor, the door stops, there's those flashes of light, the door begins to go up again, but the suspect, not wanting Dawn to realize what's going on, rushed over, hits the button, the door shuts, Dawn is none the wiser. Unfortunately, as valuable as this footage appeared to be, Kaplan was not able to make out the dark figure's face on this security video. But, the video had given him a few extremely valuable clues. Whoever killed Dawn must have known his routine. They also must have known when he would leave to take Sienna to her mother's house, and when he would likely come back home. And they also must have known that Dawn was the type of person who, when he pulled into his driveway and saw that overturned trash can, that he wouldn't just let it sit there. He would deal with it that night. He would go down there and he would turn it upright. And when Dawn was doing that, that would give the killer an opportunity to sneak into the garage. And all of this meant that the suspect didn't just know Dawn. They had to have known him very well. Detective Kaplan spent weeks speaking to everyone who knew Dawn, from coworkers to friends to his entire family, including his first wife and the 2 kids he shared with her, Tiffany and Josh, who had gone to live in Oklahoma with their mom after the divorce. When Kaplan reached the kids, who were now young adults, they said they had mostly stayed on good terms with their dad. However, they said that wasn't true of some of the other members of their family. They told Kaplan the person he should be investigating was Dawn's own brother, Dennis. They said that Dawn and Dennis had had a falling out about a year earlier, but somehow, after Dawn's death, Dennis had gotten the keys to Dawn's townhouse, and he'd been out there boxing things up and basically taking control over everything ever since. Now, Dennis was apparently telling the family that he was just trying to help, but Tiffany and Josh, they weren't sure they believed that. Towards the end of January 2017, so nearly a month after Dawn was murdered, Kaplan brought Dawn's brother, Dennis, into the Albuquerque police station for questioning. And seated across the interrogation table, Dennis seemed a little keyed up, but Kaplan couldn't tell whether he was nervous about the interview because he was guilty or irritated about it because he was innocent. Dennis said that the feud between him and his brother had started after their father had passed away in October of 2015, a little over a year earlier. The family had reached an agreement over what to do with their dad's possessions, but Dawn had violated that agreement by actually keeping one of their father's cars instead of selling it. The argument had spiraled from there, and pretty soon, Dennis said that he and Dawn were no longer on speaking terms. Dennis said he had reached out that fall and tried to reconnect, but he said Dawn never returned his calls. Dennis said he had hoped that they could at some point patch things up, if they just tried a little bit harder, but then Dennis said he had gotten the call that Dawn was dead. Kaplan narrowed his eyes as Dennis finished the explanation. He didn't really buy the reconciliation story, and Dennis's only alibi was that he was home alone when his brother was killed. So Kaplan decided to push. He asked Dennis why he'd started rooting through Dawn's house the minute the crime scene was cleared. And at this, Dennis began to get pretty defensive. He insisted he only wanted to spare the rest of his family the pain of having to do that themselves. Besides, he said, his hard work settling Dawn's affairs had actually led him to a lead about the murder that he wanted Kaplan to look into. And that was that just a few days after the murder, he'd walked into Dawn's house and found the landlord, Benny Ruiz, standing inside with no good explanation for what he was doing there. Dennis said he had heard from Dawn's neighbors that Dawn and this landlord had been going back and forth over some hole that the landlord was supposed to repair but hadn't yet. And Dennis just thought it was extremely odd that Benny would just walk into a crime scene, even if he did technically own the place. Kaplan sat back in his chair, remembering Benny Ruiz coming to the house on the day Dawn's body was found. Benny had been very quick to suggest, without any evidence, that maybe a homeless person could have broken in and murdered Dawn. Maybe, Kaplan thought now, Benny had just been trying to deflect suspicion away from himself. The next day, Kaplan brought Benny Ruiz into the station for an interview. Like Don's brother Dennis, Benny did not have a solid alibi for the night Don was killed. But he could explain why Dennis had found him inside of Don's house on that day. He said he was only there to feed the dog because nobody was looking after it during the first few days following Don's death. Benny then leaned across the table and told Kaplan that if there were one person he should be looking into, it was Dennis. Benny said that from the moment Dennis arrived, he'd been acting really weird. Benny said he owned another townhouse a few blocks away from Don's, and Dennis had apparently asked if he could rent it so he could move some of Don's stuff into it and set it up as a new home for Sienna. Benny had found this strange, and when he ran a background check on Dennis, he discovered he had a criminal record for assault and disorderly conduct, so he had told him no. Now, Kaplan already knew about the criminal record because he had run Dennis's name before bringing him in for questioning. But now, listening to this account from the landlord, he wondered why, after a year of estrangement, Dennis was suddenly so interested in his brother's life. But as the weeks passed, Kaplan just couldn't make a case against Dennis. In fact, he couldn't make a case against anybody. Neither Dennis nor Benny had alibis that could prove they weren't the killer, but there was also nothing that proved either of them were. The portrait of Don as a loving father and a man of faith who had reformed himself after some mistakes in his youth appeared to be completely accurate. Don's most recent ex-wife, Christine, had fought with Don, over custody, but that battle seemed to have cooled off, and both she and her new husband Terry had alibis. Don also didn't appear to have any girlfriends he could have been fighting with. And so there just didn't seem to be anybody who truly wanted Don dead. In February, so about 6 weeks after the murder, the local newspaper ran a front-page article saying the police had no suspects and no evidence. And when Kaplan read it, he had to admit that it was more or less the truth. The breakthrough that Kaplan desperately needed wouldn't come until March of 2017, so 12 weeks into the investigation. On that day, he got a call from the forensics lab, and they told him a key piece of evidence had just come in. And the person who had made this critical piece of evidence possible was Don Fluitt himself. Based on forensic evidence, interviews, and the police investigation, here's what police believe happened to Don Fluitt on the night of December 28, 2016. The killer waited in the darkness right outside of Don's house until the garage door opened at about 7:40 p.m. At that point, Don drove off with his daughter in the truck, and so the killer immediately darted forward and tipped over a garbage can, and then retreated back to the shadows to wait. The killer had been nursing a grudge against Don for a long time. It annoyed them that everyone thought Don was so great, because the killer knew that until just a few years earlier, Don had been this drug-abusing loser with 2 kids he didn't even care for, and another one who he deserved to lose in Sienna. But for some reason, nobody else saw Don for what he truly was. So the killer had bided their time for as long as they could stand it, but finally, they had had enough. Don was just a dark cloud hovering over their life constantly, and he had to go. The killer knew Don well enough to figure out his schedule. They knew he was due to drop his daughter off at her mother's that evening, and that he'd be coming home alone after that, and that before he went to bed, he would go into the garage to smoke a cigarette. The killer clutched a tire thumper in their hand, which is a small wooden bat used to check tire pressure, and as they clutched it, they felt their heart race with anticipation. Finally, just before 8 p.m., Don came back, and while he was out fixing the trash can, the killer snuck into the garage. They hid behind a vehicle as Don walked back up the driveway and pressed a button to close the garage door and then open the door to his own townhouse. At that point, the killer snuck out from behind the vehicle to get into position, and as they did this, they accidentally tripped the garage door sensor, sending the door rolling back up and sending those lights flashing. And so thinking fast, the killer rushed over to the panel on the wall and pressed the button again to close the garage door. Then they held their breath, listening for any movement inside the townhouse that would suggest Don was like, what's going on, and coming out to check. But Don didn't seem to notice. And so the killer breathed out a sigh of relief and took their position near the door. And then after a while, the doorknob jiggled, and the killer realized this was it. They raised their weapon, and as soon as Don opened the door, they struck him so hard the tire thumper broke into pieces. Then they punched Don again and again with their bare fists, finally letting out all the rage they'd been pushing down for so long. Don did everything he could to fight back. I mean, he had turned his life around. He had a daughter that he loved, that he was trying to build an amazing life with. He was not just going to give up here, and so as valiantly as he could, he fought the killer. But he had been gravely injured, and when he couldn't fight anymore, he just tried to crawl under his truck and hide. But the killer pulled him out and landed one last punch to his face. Don stopped moving, and at that point, the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and they squeezed. But the killer wasn't done. To make sure Don was dead, they also went into Don's apartment, grabbed a knife from the kitchen, came back into the garage, knelt down, and ruthlessly slit Don's throat. Blood ran out of the wound and poured onto the concrete. The killer found some bleach inside and tried to clean up the mess as best as they could. But they left behind one crucial piece of evidence. Don was not able to save his own life. But by aggressively fighting back, he'd given investigators a clue that would solve his murder, and also ensure that in his absence, his daughter Sienna would grow up in a safe and secure home. Because the key piece of forensic evidence that was left behind that solved the case was DNA found under Don's fingernails that belonged to none other than Sienna's own stepfather, Terry White. It would turn out that Terry's story to the cops about being at his sister's until 9 p.m. was a lie. And so, on April 3rd, 2017, just over 3 months after Don's murder, Terry White was arrested and charged with murder. After his arrest, Terry cast blame on his wife, Christine, saying she was the one who put him up to it so they could have Sienna to themselves. And so Christine was also arrested and charged with murder, but the charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Terry, however, was convicted in August of 2018 of first-degree murder, aggravated burglary, and tampering with evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison plus 12 years. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Okay, we just wrapped up the 15 city live tour. Like literally, this is my first day back in the studio. The tour was amazing, really. It was awesome. It was so good to meet
the fans of The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious in person. That was really cool. But I knew there was one story I had to tell first off once I got back in the studio, and it's the one I'm doing right now. It is the final story from the set list from the tour. So if you didn't see the tour, well, you're in luck. You're seeing the best story of the tour. Now, technically, we briefly covered this story like 4.5 years ago. However, it was terrible. I went back and looked at this video, and it was just poorly put together. It's like really short, and so many of the key parts of the story were just omitted because I didn't know what I was doing. But now I sort of do, and this story was completely broken down, restructured, rewritten, and the end result is this totally horrifying, like, encore story from the live tour that I really think, even if you've heard the OG before, you're gonna love this one. This one, by far, got the biggest reaction from the thousands and thousands of people that watched this live. Okay, so this is called What's in the Basement, and it's really good. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of The Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button you're going to gift them tickets to my first ever live storytelling tour, but don't tell them you got them tickets that are mid-row floor seats to the Indianapolis show. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible. But what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it, and it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board, they go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey, Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again. Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time. And the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark. It's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seem sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound. It was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic. Like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom and she goes up to her big sister and she's like, "Do you hear that tapping sound?" And Tina's like, "Yeah, what is that?" And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, "Wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her?" And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, "Mom, is that you down there?" And immediately there's a response. Tap, tap, tap. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. "Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you." Tap, tap, tap. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother, and again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom, and even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor and they're hearing this tapping and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually, after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her. Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. I mean, they've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. I mean, he's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited, and they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, you know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house, I'm sure of it. And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms and they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? And so Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue. And they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all, but he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's Mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is Mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets. And it was frightening. And they would call their dad in and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's Mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. It's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls hey, come on guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. There's nothing that's going to harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You got to let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's Mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. These tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. When Dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls, because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion, as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're going to have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, Dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is. But she doesn't want to be away from her sister. And so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen. She goes to the door to the basement. Karen follows right behind her. And Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like, every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was, a washing machine or something, because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then. And then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound because it's real for them. Like, maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house, but there has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet. Come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified. And they sprint up the stairs, they bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls, we don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house, you're safe here, we'll wait for your dad to come home, he'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical. They go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank, at this point, in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere, but there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me," but it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house and he talks to his girls, and he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning, and he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls, like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted, and I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things, and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning, so we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds, but they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them, like zero, and it was not going to change. And on some level, like, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so in this sort of vulnerable moment where the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad, like, "Fine, like, whatever, we'll go to grief counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling, and right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Like, peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1986. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm. There's no more tapping, nothing, everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household, and when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house, and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks, like, that's weird. Like, I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, "Oh, that's weird." So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like, if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like, he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen, and he's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You got to remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. With the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. And he's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the 2 daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like, again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all 3 girls, the 2 daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic, nobody there either. They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement. Like, there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs, and he's staring. And as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls who are so shocked, they're just in silence staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls, go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom. So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut, and there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in, there's this vicious struggle, and Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground, she runs next door to that neighbor's house, she slams on the door, the neighbor comes out, and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house!" And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency. They call the police, and then minutes later, the police show up, and when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household, and Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom, and he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over, they put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down, they get the other two girls down, so everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house. And now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property. And we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here. And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household, and despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. Like there was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town. There was no leads and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Like basically nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, you know what, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house, because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking like, nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff, and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking, like, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7, like, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, like, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what? Just in case, I need to call the police because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone and he calls the police and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door, he opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, I'm going to kill you, Tina, or I'm going to kill you, Karen. And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements. And so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like clearly the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly that must have happened because they didn't do this. Somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart looking for this maniac. They look everywhere and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives. That's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now, Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching. And he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm going to pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from it's your mom and it's good to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafsons' house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. As of this video, Danny LaPlante is still alive and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it, he did not get parole, but during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates in the entire prison system.
Late on the afternoon of March 22nd, 2015, 29-year-old Denise Huskins reached for her buzzing cell phone, and when she saw who was texting her, she immediately felt this knot of anxiety in her stomach. It was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Aaron Quinn, and right now, at least according to Denise, they were off, and likely it was going to stay that way. But now, Aaron was texting Denise, saying he really wanted to talk to her and would she please come over. It was a Sunday, and Denise was home alone in her little apartment in Vallejo, California, which is inside the San Francisco Bay Area, and Denise really just did not have it in her to go talk to her ex-boyfriend. Really, she didn't have plans to go out anywhere. She just wanted to stay in. And so she typed back that she was in for the night and this would have to wait. But as soon as she sent that text, immediately she got another text from Aaron. For a long minute, Denise just sat there on the couch looking at her phone, wondering what she was going to do. Denise and Aaron had met the previous summer after Denise had moved to Vallejo from Boston, Massachusetts to work at a hospital in Vallejo called Kaiser Hospital. Denise had her PhD in physical therapy, and Kaiser Hospital had a great physical therapy program, especially for people with brain and spinal cord injuries. And Kaiser Hospital was also where Aaron worked. She and Aaron had been immediately attracted to each other. Aaron was tall and fit with dark hair and piercing eyes, and he loved to cook. And Denise, she was blonde and blue-eyed and very outdoorsy and driven. And so pretty much right away, Aaron and Denise would get into these intense conversations where they each would kind of dive into the other person's life. I mean, they were really connecting on a deep level. But even though they both clearly got along great and they were really connecting, their relationship got off to kind of a rocky start. Aaron had actually been engaged to be married before he met Denise, but Aaron's fiance had cheated on him, and so he had ended the relationship. And it was during that time, right after this relationship had ended, that he met Denise. And so Denise was kind of like a rebound, and she kind of felt like a rebound. But again, they're getting along great, and so both were optimistic that it was more than that. And so Aaron and Denise had officially begun dating in the fall of 2014. But 7 months later, so in March of 2015, when Denise was getting these text messages from Aaron, at least in Denise's mind, their relationship really was done. Because Denise had caught Aaron texting his ex-fiance, basically begging her to get back together with him. And so Denise felt really hurt. You know, she understood that that was a really intense relationship. And of course, Aaron would still have feelings for his ex to some degree, but she felt really betrayed. And so she told Aaron that that was it. But it was really painful for Denise because she did love Aaron, even though she knew, this relationship likely wasn't going to work. And now here Aaron was blowing up her cell phone with text messages to meet up and talk, and he just wasn't taking no for an answer. And so Denise finally typed out this long message back to Aaron, basically saying, look, I don't feel comfortable coming to your house. It's the house that you shared with your ex. I don't want to go there. We can talk another time. I think for right now, what you need to focus on, Aaron, is kind of like recording me. Take me out on dates and show me that you really want to be with me, because right now there's no trust. And Aaron, to his credit, wrote back to Denise and basically said, yes, I'm definitely willing to do that. I want to put in the work to win you back. I care about you, Denise. But he said, I really have something important to tell you, and I just don't feel comfortable talking about it anywhere else besides at my house. So please, can you just come over tonight? It's really important that I see you. And at first, Denise really did just kind of hold the line, and she told Aaron that, no, I'm not going to come to your house. But again, Aaron, he just would not let it go, and he really seemed actually very eager to see Denise, and it made Denise feel special. And so eventually she kind of gave it up and said, you know what? Okay, I'll come by. And after that, Denise got up off the couch, she got dressed, she called their favorite pizza place and ordered some pizza that she would pick up and bring to his house for them to eat that night. And then she headed out to her car and pulled out of her driveway. At about 5:30 p.m. that night, Denise arrived at Aaron's two-story home on Mare Island, which is actually just a little peninsula in Vallejo, California. And Denise, she grabbed the pizzas off the passenger seat. She grabbed her overnight bag because she was optimistic that, they're about to have a great talk and maybe rekindle and maybe she'll stay the night. And so with her things and her pizza, she walked up to the front door and knocked. The next day was a Monday, and Aaron and Denise were both scheduled to work at the hospital that day. But at around 7 a.m. that morning, Aaron called into the hospital sick and said he couldn't come in, and Denise sent a text message to her boss saying that a family emergency had just come up and she would not be at work all week. When Denise's boss got this text message, immediately he was like, this doesn't make any sense. First of all, Denise never missed work, so this was totally anomalous. And he also knew that Denise was applying for this very prestigious orthopedic fellowship that she needed to submit the paperwork for by Friday. And he knew she had a lot of work to do on this paperwork that basically required her to be at work that week to get it all done. And so if she was missing the week, then it looked like she would not be applying for this fellowship. And that just seemed totally unusual because Denise was really serious about this fellowship. And so Denise's boss wrote back to her and just said, I understand you have an emergency, we're here if you need us, take whatever time you need. And then a few hours later, her boss checked his phone again and he saw that she had not written him back. And so Denise's boss was like, wow, I guess, she really must be dealing with some serious family emergency that's keeping her from using her phone. About 7 hours later, at around 2 p.m. on this Monday, where Aaron and Denise have not shown up for work, there was a 911 call that came into the Vallejo Police Department. And the person making the 911 call was Aaron. And Aaron's voice was totally slurred, and then he told this very confusing story about some sort of kidnapping, and then he begged police for help. 2 police officers happened to be near Mare Island, where Aaron lived, and so within 2 minutes of this 911 call coming in, those 2 officers were knocking on Aaron's front door. And when Aaron let them inside, these officers noticed 3 things in quick succession. The first was Aaron was obviously drunk or high. He was under the influence of some substance. He just did not seem right. 2, there were at least a dozen empty beer bottles lining a back wall in the kitchen. And 3, the entire house reeked of cleaning chemicals. One of the officers immediately turned to Aaron and said, "Are you on drugs?" And Aaron would say, "Yes, I am on drugs, but these drugs were given to me by the kidnappers." The officers immediately exchanged confused glances, looked back at Aaron, and then just said, "Okay, well, we're going to take a look around." And so the officers wound up going upstairs, and as they went upstairs, that cleaning chemical smell got stronger and stronger, and they made their way into the master bedroom, and they saw the ground had obviously been recently vacuumed, and that cleaning smell was really strong in here. The sheets on the bed were all gone, except for the fitted sheet that sat over the mattress. And so the officers were about to leave the master bedroom and keep looking when one of the officers stopped and he noticed something on the bed, and he called the other officer over, and they walked over and they looked down, and sure enough, on the bed was about a quarter-sized drop of blood. The police officers left the master bedroom and they went back downstairs where Aaron was, and they walked up to him and said, "Okay, tell us again what happened with these kidnappers and what's going on here." And Aaron would launch into a totally bizarre story. Through slurred speech, Aaron would say 12 hours earlier, so around 3 in the morning that morning, so early Monday morning, Aaron said he was in his house with his girlfriend, Denise, when suddenly these men wearing wetsuits broke into the house, and they immediately tied up Aaron and Denise and then made them wear these goggles that had been all taped up, so once they were on your face, you couldn't see anything. Aaron would tell the police that the intruders, in addition to wearing wetsuits, they also were carrying guns, tasers, also laser pointers, and also very high-powered flashlights. And so when they came in, there were all these lights and beams everywhere. I mean, it was totally chaotic. Aaron then explained to police that after he and Denise had been tied up and had these goggles on, the men in wetsuits came over to them and put headphones on each of them, and then they played this recording, which had this weird, soothing music, and then somebody narrating, telling Aaron and Denise that they were not in any danger, that this was just a robbery, and to stay calm and nothing would happen to them. And so Aaron and Denise had done just that. They tried to follow orders, and then at some point the headphones came off, and both Aaron and Denise were told to go to separate rooms, and they kind of fumbled their way into the separate rooms, at which point the men demanded they give up their banking information and passwords, and Aaron and Denise did that. They gave up all their banking info, and then Aaron and Denise were brought back into the living room. They were tied back up again, and then even though Aaron and Denise couldn't actually see this, they heard the sound of somebody apparently coming in that sounded like a doctor, who then took Aaron and Denise's blood pressure before administering this drug to them that made them both very sleepy. And then before Aaron and Denise passed out from this drug, Denise was taken by the intruders, and the intruders told Aaron that they had rigged a camera system inside of his house to watch him so he couldn't leave to go save Denise.
And so Aaron basically just stayed in the house until he fell asleep from this drug. And then when he woke up again and managed to get his restraints off, he saw that Denise really was gone. And so Denise had to be with the kidnappers. After Aaron was done telling this totally weird story, which again, you got to remember, as he's talking, he sounds totally drunk. And so they kept having to ask him to say again what he was saying. And, Aaron's just kind of loopy. And so the whole thing is just so weird. And so when Aaron was finally done telling the story, the two officers just stared at him in silence. And then the officers looked at each other, and without even saying anything, they both were thinking the same thing. Probably this guy has killed his girlfriend, Denise, and after he killed her, he must have spent time cleaning the house, which is why they smelled all the cleaning chemicals. And then maybe when he was done, he felt bad about what he had done. And so he began drinking beers to kind of cope with what he had done. And that's why all those empty bottles were there. And that's why he was acting so drunk right now. And then at some point he had worked up the courage to call 911 and pretend that he didn't know where his girlfriend was and make up this whole alibi about these weird kidnappers that came in and did this stuff. But obviously it was just a ruse. This guy killed his girlfriend. That's what happened. And so finally, one of these officers spoke to Aaron and they said, "You're going to need to come to the station with us and explain yourself." It didn't take long for the police in Vallejo to launch this massive search all over Mare Island to look for Denise. And at this point, they were kind of looking for a body because based on what was going on in Aaron's house and the story he told, it did seem like very likely she had been murdered and disposed of somewhere. And so they had dogs out and dive teams out in the water. They had hundreds of volunteers looking everywhere. And at the same time, Aaron was brought to the police station and they began going over every single detail of his story, trying to get more information about these kidnappers, because as much as they didn't believe him, they did need to officially rule out that there was no kidnapping. And so they needed all the information about these kidnappers, who they were, what they looked like, what they sounded like, everything. And at the same time police were talking to Aaron, police also brought in Denise's roommate, and they asked the roommate, "Do you know anything about Denise's relationship with Aaron?" And the roommate would say, those two have had a very troubled relationship. And the roommate would say that, as far as they understood, Aaron and Denise were not a couple anymore. And so police would actually go over to Aaron in the police station and they would say, "Hey, we have people saying that you and Denise, who you called your girlfriend, you guys were not dating. You had broken up. Explain yourself." And Aaron would say, "Well, actually, that's why Denise was coming over. Before all this kidnapping happened, she was coming over so we could reconcile." And we did. We had reconciled. We were back together when the kidnappers in wetsuits came inside the house. But the more police looked into Aaron's kidnapping story, the less it made sense. And it really didn't make sense to begin with. And so really it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. Like, for one, Aaron said that he and Denise had been kind of forced to give up their banking information and their passwords, and they did that. They gave that up to the kidnappers. But when police looked into Aaron and Denise's banking records, there was no money withdrawn. The only activity on either of those accounts was on Aaron's account. 2 hours before Aaron called 911, he called his credit card holder and attempted to get them to give him a large cash advance so he could buy a boat. When police asked Aaron about the strong cleaning chemicals smell in his house, Aaron absolutely denied doing anything to clean his house. He didn't know how that happened. Also, Aaron would tell police that these kidnappers had actually wanted a ransom to be paid to them, but he said it was only for $8,500. And so police are like, why would these kidnappers take Denise and run away with her and risk very serious jail time for $8,500? It just seemed way too low for what they were doing. And then there was another weird detail that came out of interviewing Aaron at the police station. One of the police officers had noticed that Aaron's eyes were totally dilated, his pupils were huge, and for a little while, police had thought maybe that was because he was on some drug or something which can cause your pupils to dilate. But based on the weirdness of the story that Aaron was relaying to them, they actually began to suspect that Aaron was having a schizophrenic break. That is a symptom of a schizophrenic break. Schizophrenia is a very serious
serious mental illness that often begins to appear in young adults, and Aaron was only 30 years old, so he's at the right age for this to happen. And while schizophrenia does not make people violent, it does make people very paranoid, and it also can cause hallucinations and mental disturbances. And so when police were looking at the details of Aaron's story about men in wetsuits breaking into his house and taking his blood pressure before stealing his girlfriend, but also cleaning his house at some point, that just seemed so weird and kind of crazy that it did seem to kind of line up with schizophrenia. By 9 p.m. on March 23rd, so 7 hours after Aaron had called 911 to report Denise missing, the Vallejo police decided they needed to call in the FBI because this was just so weird, and we have this missing person who could have been kidnapped, or maybe they're dead or hurt or something. I mean, there was just so much going on with this case, they needed backup. And when the FBI arrived in Vallejo, the first thing they did is they took Aaron and they gave him a lie detector test, and he failed it completely. And after finding out he had failed it completely, he immediately lawyered up. By the next day, March 24th, there were over 100 different search teams all across Mare Island and around Vallejo, California, looking for Denise. Police sonar had also picked up a body-sized mass out in the bay, but so far the divers had not been able to find it. Aaron, by this point, had gotten his lawyer and left the police station, and by now, Denise's picture was all over the news and newspapers. It was up on posters on telephone poles all over town, and TV news channels were parked outside of Aaron's house, just waiting for him to come out or waiting for any activity. But despite all this activity, the detectives and the FBI agents that were working this case had really not made any significant progress. All they thought was, Aaron's definitely hiding something. But then something changed. A little bit after noon on March 24th, a reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle, who was camped outside of Aaron's home, got a very weird email. The email was from the kidnappers, the wetsuit-wearing, blood pressure-taking kidnappers who broke into Aaron's home and took Denise. And in this email to the reporter, it said that Denise was fine, and there actually was a recording of Denise's voice reading that day's news, which confirmed that she was alive at least as recently as that morning. But there were two very suspicious things about this email. The first one was the recording of Denise's voice, the proof of life recording. Well, she did not sound in any way stressed. She sounded utterly calm, like she was reading the news, like it was completely no big deal.
Earlier today, there was a plane crash in the Alps.
And the second thing that was very suspicious was the email address the kidnappers had used to message this reporter was an email address that belonged to Aaron. When this reporter told police about this, investigators were like, you know what, this actually doesn't make this any more clear. This makes things exponentially more confusing. Denise did appear to be alive, which was a good thing, but it now really appeared that Aaron was involved in whatever was going on here, and based on how calm Denise sounded on this recording, she could be involved in it too. And investigators' suspicions only grew when they went to Aaron and they asked him, have the kidnappers tried calling you at any point? And Aaron would say, yes, they have, and he showed them his phone. Well, the police would trace the phone calls that Aaron claimed had come into his cell phone from the kidnappers, and when they traced the kidnapper's number, they found it was connected to a burner phone. A burner phone is something that drug dealers will use because it's totally anonymous. It's like a one-time use cell phone that you use temporarily, you have this number temporarily, and then when you're done with the phone, there's no history that you personally had that cell phone. But police were clever, and they figured out where this burner phone was actually purchased from, and it was purchased from a nearby Target, and they looked at the security footage of around the time when this burner phone, was purchased from this Target, and they saw the person who had bought it walk out of the store. And the person who had bought this burner phone was this white man who was tall and fit with dark hair, and it basically looked exactly like Aaron. And then, 2 days later, on March 25th, Denise herself walked up to her mother's home in Huntington Beach, California, which is roughly 400 miles south of Vallejo, California, where she went missing. And so Denise's mother was not home when Denise showed up on her doorstep, and so Denise wound up going to the next door neighbor and using their phone to call her father. And Denise's story that she would tell her dad was even more bizarre than Aaron's story. She said she had been held captive by 4 men in this small room, and these men would tell her that they were simply doing a task for a client, and what they were doing now with her was just following their protocol. Denise would tell police that she was well taken care of while she was in captivity. They let her eat food, they gave her water, they even let her shower and brush her teeth. Denise initially was very open to speaking to Vallejo police detectives about what happened to her, but when they said the FBI really wanted to talk to her and they would literally send a jet to her in Huntington Beach and fly her back to Vallejo, she refused. And then, like Aaron, she immediately lawyered up and stopped talking. And so by this point, all the investigators are like, there's no way these two actually got kidnapped. This whole thing is some weird, elaborate hoax, and now they know they've been caught, and so they're going quiet. And so that night that Denise was found, on March 25th, the Vallejo police held a press conference and told the public that they do not believe these two were ever kidnapped. They don't really know what happened, but at this point they are not pursuing kidnappers, and the public should not be worried about rogue kidnappers in the area. But after this press conference, the police couldn't help but think to themselves, why would these two people who are successful, they come from good families, they have loads of future prospects, their lives were good. Why would they stage this hoax? What do they stand to gain? It really just didn't make any sense. For weeks, the investigation into whatever happened to Aaron and Denise continued, but there was virtually no progress. The media was still very interested in this case. It was totally salacious, and they had dubbed this case the Gone Girl case in reference to a movie about a woman who fakes her own kidnapping. As for Denise and Aaron, they stayed lawyered up, and the only message they put out to the public was that they were telling the truth. And so really, this case just didn't make sense to anybody until about 2.5 months later, on June 5th, 2015. Early that morning, a police officer in a town called Dublin, which is just south of Vallejo, California, found a piece of evidence that basically broke the Gone Girl case wide open. The evidence this police officer found was a cell phone. Not a burner phone that's totally anonymous, but a real cell phone that is registered with a phone company and therefore is registered with an individual person. And police were able to trace this cell phone back to its owner. And this discovery would lead investigators 200 miles to the northeast of Vallejo to the small remote cabin in South Lake Tahoe, California. And at this cabin, police would find a stolen car, a white Mustang. And the white Mustang actually belonged to someone who lived in Vallejo. And so, with their guns drawn and their dogs at the ready to be released, the police and the FBI, they opened up the door to this cabin, and inside was a tall, fit, and slender white man with dark hair. The cabin was a total mess, with discarded food and trash and piles of clothes everywhere, but none of that really stood out to the police. Instead, what stood out to them as they're yelling at this guy to stay where he is all around the cabin, all over the ground, kind of on top of all the trash and mess, were things like laser pointers and high-powered flashlights and zip ties and goggles, like swim goggles, with tape all across the front of them blocking out your view. The police had finally found one of the kidnappers. And while this kidnapper looked exactly like Aaron, he was a tall, fit, slender white man with dark hair, it wasn't Aaron. In fact, neither Aaron nor Denise had ever met this person, and this person, this kidnapper, had never met Denise or Aaron. There was absolutely no connection between them. This kidnapper's name was Matthew Muller, and he was a 38-year-old Harvard-trained lawyer and former Marine who had totally just crashed and burned out of his law practice and then took up this life of committing all these totally bizarre crimes. It would turn out the totally weird stories that Aaron and Denise had told police about what had happened to them was all true. The only thing they got wrong was there wasn't multiple people breaking into the house in wetsuits. It was only ever one person. It was Matthew Muller, the guy behind all this. And maybe just kind of in their panic and not knowing what's going on, Aaron and Denise had kind of thought, oh, there's multiple people here. But there wasn't. It was just Matthew. Also, it would turn out Aaron and Denise were not the first people that Matthew had done this to. The reason that police officer in Dublin, California had found that cell phone, which broke the case wide open and led police to this cabin in South Lake Tahoe, was because on the night that officer found the cell phone, so June 5th, Matthew Muller had attacked another couple in the middle of the night in their home. But that couple had been able to fight Matthew Muller off, and Matthew had dropped his cell phone in their home before he fled. And so when this couple had reported this to police, that was how they got that cell phone. In terms of Muller's motivation for doing what he was doing, well, Muller was absolutely brilliant, like borderline genius, super smart guy, but he was extremely mentally unwell. He had severe psychosis, and he was also bipolar. And so basically he wasn't seeing reality for what it was. And at some point in one of his kind of psychotic fits, he had somehow came across Aaron and Denise and become absolutely obsessed with them. He began surveilling them nonstop with a drone for 3 weeks before he attacked them, learning their patterns and who they talked to and what they did. And in fact, Aaron, when he found out that was what Matthew was doing, watching him and Denise with a drone, Aaron would tell police, oh my goodness, I actually remember one night before the kidnapping looking up and seeing this glinting light in the sky, and he thought, that looks like a drone, why is it out here? But Aaron was a normal person and didn't suspect that somebody who was totally unhinged was spying on him with a drone, and so he had forgotten about it. And so after Muller had surveilled Aaron and Denise for 3 weeks using his drone, he was ready. And so in the middle of the night, he broke into Aaron's house wearing a wetsuit. He tied up Aaron and Denise, and he put those goggles on both of them so they couldn't see anything. And then he put on those headphones on both of them that played the soothing music and also had that narration where it was telling them, hey, you're going to be fine. This is a robbery. Just stay calm and do what you're told. But after these headphones went on both of them, Matthew would sexually assault Denise. And in fact, at least one other victim of Matthew Muller has come forward since his arrest to say that she too was sexually assaulted by Matt. And so after Matt had taken Denise and left Aaron's house with her, Aaron, he did fall asleep from the drug he was given from Matthew. And then when he woke up the next morning, he managed to get out of his restraints. And, he's still affected by the drug that was in his system. And he sees that Denise is gone. And so the first thing he does is, oh my God, I need to find a way to pay the ransom to this kidnapper. Because again, the kidnapper, Matthew, had said around Aaron that he wanted $8,500. And so Aaron thought he could get that money. And so he called his credit card company and asked for that cash advance for $8,500 to pay this ransom. But when they asked Aaron why he needed this money, he didn't want to give up that it was for a ransom because he didn't want the kidnapper to know that he had talked to authorities. He was worried about Denise. And so kind of in a panic, Aaron just told the credit card company that he was buying a boat, but really it was for the ransom. Also, Aaron was the one who called in to Kaiser Hospital for both him and Denise, saying they were missing work. He did this because Matthew at some point had instructed Aaron that he would have to do that or something would happen to Denise. And so again, he's just kind of following the instructions, hoping that he can get Denise back. As for the email that the San Francisco Chronicle reporter got that apparently was from the kidnappers, but was sent from Aaron's email account, well, that really was the kidnapper, Matthew Muller, sending this email to the reporter. He just used a special program to basically hijack Aaron's email address. And as for Denise sounding very calm in her proof of life recording that was attached to that email, well, the thought is Denise was very likely in shock at the time she was asked to record this, and so it sounded like she was relaxed, but really she wasn't. Also, just a random side note that I'm sure some of you will have questions about. We don't know why Aaron's house smelled like chemicals. It's assumed that, maybe when Aaron and Denise were all tied up and couldn't see anything because of their goggles, that Matthew Muller, I guess, walked around their house and cleaned it, but we don't know for sure. Matthew Muller is currently serving a 40-year sentence in prison for federal crimes, and just recently he was sentenced to an additional 31 years in prison for state crimes that were in connection to the kidnappings of Aaron and Denise. Aaron and Denise would go on to sue the city of Vallejo, California for basically mistreating them. They had been telling the truth the whole time, but nobody took them seriously, and they would win $2.5 million. Aaron and Denise would go on to get married, they would have a baby, and they would write a book together about their experience, which is called Victim F: From Crime Victims to Suspects to Survivors.
walked in with that red dress way, like a match in the middle of May. My name fell slow from your tongue, and I forgot where I come from. Your heel taps like a warning sign. Your eyes say stay, your hips say mine. I try to act cool, play tough, but one look from you is enough. Oh, the room starts spinning when you lean that way. My heart keeps running, but my feet won't say. Cállate fuego, you set me on fire. Cállate fuego, baby, take me higher. Cállate fuego, I can't let go. Cállate fuego, you got my soul.
Do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp, and if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please replace the like button's eye drops with acid. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username is the same on both platforms. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts,